France versus Britain, 1815 AD, the Battle of Waterloo. The Emperor's final sunset. Night presses over the drenched Belgian fields, and the road to Brussels is a ribbon of mud. A lantern flickers inside a farmhouse called La Belle Alliance, where a fallen empire takes one last breath. At dawn, two ridgelines face each other like clenched jaws. Wellington's thin red line hidden behind hedges and hollow ground. Napoleon's veterans stamping their boots, steam in the cold air. The ground is soaked from an all-night storm. That alone will delay the first cannon by hours. And here's the chilling truth that most never hear aloud. In just 8 hours, nearly 50,000 men will be dead, wounded, or missing, erased by rain, smoke, and iron. A rider waits for the signal. A drummer boy grips the sticks that will start the avalanche. Down the Allied line, a farmhouse called Hougoumont sits like a stone in a riverbed. Whoever holds it will shape the flood. The Emperor studies the ridge, certain of what he sees. The Duke, calm as a winter lake, bets everything on what he knows. But somewhere beyond the trees, another army is moving, and when those black coats appear on the horizon, if they appear, the day will turn, or end. We don't know yet. Hougoumont, a gate to nowhere. The first flames rose just after midday. They licked through the dry wood of Hougoumont's barn, turning the smoke orange against the grey sky. The sound of musket fire echoed from its orchard walls, a steady, maddening rhythm like the beating of a trapped heart. From the ridge above, Wellington could see little more than flickers of movement, silhouettes vanishing in smoke. He said nothing, only muttered, "Let them spend their strength there." To the men inside those walls, it felt less like strategy and more like hell. Guardsman Matthew Clay wiped the grime from his face and loaded his musket again. His hands shook, not from fear, at least not entirely, but from exhaustion. The French were everywhere. They came through the orchards in lines so dense the trees seemed to bleed blue and white. Each volley cut them down, yet still they came. The great wooden gate of Hougoumont stood barely upright, splintered from cannon fire. When it burst open earlier that morning, a wave of Frenchmen had surged through, screaming, bayonets glinting. For one frozen heartbeat, it had seemed the courtyard would fall. Then, from nowhere, a handful of British guards slammed the gate shut behind them, trapping dozens of French soldiers inside. The fighting that followed was savage, hand to hand, blade to fist. When it was done, the courtyard ran with blood, but the gate held, and that gate, simple wood and iron, became a symbol. For Napoleon, it was an insult that demanded vengeance. For Wellington, it was a lure. Most people never knew this detail. The Emperor sent over 12,000 men against Hougoumont throughout the day, 12,000 against barely 2,000 defenders. A battle within the battle, eating men and time alike. By early afternoon, the air was so thick with powder smoke that the sun vanished behind it. Inside the chateau, men fought in near darkness, lit only by fire and muzzle flashes. The walls shuddered with every cannon blast. Clay felt the ground tremble beneath him as a shell landed in the chapel nearby. For a moment, he thought he'd gone deaf. Then came the screaming. Outside, French officers pleaded for reinforcements. "We are close, sire. One more push and it's ours." They insisted. Napoleon hesitated. He watched from his command post, spyglass glinting, and frowned. The British defence there was consuming far more of his army than he'd planned. "Enough," he muttered. "Let them rot behind their walls. The main blow comes next." But he lied to himself. Even as he spoke, another brigade was already marching toward that cursed farmhouse, drawn in like moths to flame. And this is where everything changed. On the ridge, Wellington's calm mask cracked for the first time that day. Reports came in fast. Centre under pressure, right flank holding, left still waiting. His army was thin, brittle but alive. He turned to his aide, Fitzroy Somerset. "Tell them to hold Hougoumont no matter what. It's drawing his attention. That's our advantage." Down in the valley, the French began to reposition. Columns of infantry wheeled left toward the British centre, the Emperor's true hammer finally in motion. But the delay had cost him precious hours. The sky was already dimming, and to the east, a faint rumble of distant guns, not thunder, something else. The Prussians were coming. Napoleon refused to believe it. He ordered Marshal Ney to prepare the next assault anyway. Ney, the bravest of the brave, rode forward with his hat in hand, rallying the cavalry. "We'll break them this time," he shouted, eyes blazing. "We'll drive them into the sea." Tens of thousands of horsemen formed up. Cuirassiers in polished armour, lancers, dragoons. each one gleaming in the fading light. They were the pride of France, the Emperor's steel thunder. When Ney gave the signal, they moved as one, hooves shaking the ground like an earthquake. Wellington watched from the ridge as the shimmering tide advanced. "They're coming again," he said quietly. Then louder to his troops, "Form squares!" And so they did. On the ridge, the British infantry folded into tight boxes, 4 ranks deep, bayonets bristling outward. It was a formation born from fear and genius alike. Against cavalry, it was a wall of death. The French charged uphill, sabres flashing, bugles screaming. They hit the squares like waves against rock, and every time they fell back, leaving the field littered with men and horses. Ney charged 5 times 5, each time believing the next would break the line. Each time the ridge held. Still, the air grew thicker with death. The fields turned red beneath the rain-soaked mud. And while Ney fought like a lion, he could not see what Napoleon finally did. A new army was indeed forming on the eastern horizon. Black coats, thousands of them. Blucher's Prussians. Napoleon's face hardened. "So," he whispered, "the dead have returned." He ordered part of his army to pivot east, to face this new threat. But it was already too late. The balance was shifting. The Emperor's masterpiece was crumbling before it could be finished. And yet, the fire of Hougomont still burned. Inside the chateau, the defenders were down to their last cartridges. Clay's hands were bleeding, his musket fouled. The courtyard was a charred ruin, bodies piled against the walls. But as long as the gate stood, they refused to yield. One soldier began to sing softly, a hymn drowned by the roar outside. For a brief moment the smoke parted, and Clay saw the sky glowing red through the broken rafters. He thought of home, he thought of silence. Then the walls shook again, and he was pulled back into the madness. Out beyond the burning farm, the French cavalry regrouped for yet another charge, unaware that time itself was their enemy now. The Emperor turned to one of his marshals. "We finish this before nightfall." But destiny had other plans. As dusk fell, the thunder of guns from the east grew louder. The Prussian vanguard was nearly there. Napoleon had no choice: split his army or be crushed between 2 walls. He chose to fight both. The battlefield became a storm of overlapping battles, each screaming louder than the last. Ney, with his face blackened by powder, led another assault up the ridge, shouting for infantry that no longer followed. His horse was shot beneath him. He rose and kept running, sabre drawn, as if sheer will could change the outcome. And at Hougomont, amid the flames and ruin, a final volley echoed, a defiant heartbeat in the gathering dark. When the smoke cleared, the farmhouse still stood. A burnt shell, yes, but unbroken. The flag above it, torn and blackened, fluttered stubbornly against the night wind. From his distant vantage, Wellington lowered his spyglass and exhaled. "Good men," he murmured. "They've held the gate." He turned his gaze eastward. In the distance, he saw it. Movement on the far road, torches glimmering like stars in fog. The Prussians. And for the first time that day, the Duke allowed himself a faint smile. But on the French line, panic was spreading. Drums beat erratically. Officers shouted orders lost to noise. The Emperor's map no longer matched the battlefield. The storm he had unleashed was now beyond control. Still, he refused to yield. "Prepare the guard," he commanded quietly. "If the world is ending, it will end on my terms." And as the night deepened over Waterloo, the black coats drew nearer, the ground trembled with approaching guns, and the Emperor's most loyal soldiers, the Old Guard, began to march toward their destiny. The air smelled of smoke and rain, the sky of endings, and though no one yet knew it, the final sunset of Napoleon's empire had already begun to fall. The storm before the thunder, the rain had not stopped for 12 hours. It fell in thick, unbroken sheets, turning every path between the villages of Waterloo and La Belle Alliance into a drowning river of clay. Horses stumbled, wheels sank, and men cursed under their breath as lightning flashed across the sky. Somewhere beyond the storm, a single man in a grey coat stood watching the horizon. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, now exiled, returned and facing destiny once more. He could smell the damp gunpowder, hear the dripping of water on his hat brim. He whispered to himself almost in disbelief, "One more victory, and France will rise again." But fate had something else planned. Across the sodden valley, the Duke of Wellington sat inside a dim farmhouse, his boots drying by the fire, his coat still soaked. Outside, aides whispered that the Emperor's forces were near. Wellington only nodded, eyes on the map spread before him. "He'll attack where he shouldn't," he murmured. "And when he does, we'll make him bleed for every yard." They were two men who understood war like chess. But that night, the board itself was against them both. At dawn, the rain eased, leaving the air heavy and metallic. Drummers beat slow rolls through the mist. French soldiers lit fires to dry their powder, unaware that the delay was sealing their fate. The Emperor waited for the ground to firm. He could not risk his artillery bogging down in mud. But with every lost hour, the Prussians, defeated but unbroken at Ligny, were marching closer. And this is where everything changed. A young French captain rode to Napoleon's camp, his uniform splattered with mud. "Sire," he reported, "we believe the enemy is retreating." The Emperor smiled faintly. "Good. Then they will fight on ground of my choosing." He believed the British would flee to the coast. He believed the Prussians were gone. But he believed wrong. By 9 o'clock, Wellington's men stood ready along a ridge that looked harmless, just a low rise behind a patchwork of farms. But hidden behind that ridge were thousands. Infantry crouched, cannon masked, cavalry waiting like coiled steel. The air was still. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the first thunder that wasn't from the sky. French cannon fire rolled like distant drums of doom, shaking the sodden hills. The Battle of Waterloo had begun. Smoke poured across the fields, blending with fog. The French infantry advanced in vast columns, blue coats gleaming under a sun that finally broke through the haze. They looked unstoppable, a human tide of precision and fury. And yet, something was off. The ground swallowed their boots. The cannonballs fell short. The Emperor's grand plan met the simplest enemy of all: mud. Wellington watched through his spyglass. He could see the French struggling, the formations losing shape. His calm voice cut through the noise. "Now, let them come closer." At Hougoumont, a walled chateau on his right flank, he had placed a handful of elite guardsmen. Their orders: hold to the last man. By noon, the storm of musket fire there was constant. Flames licked through the orchard walls. French soldiers tried to break through the great wooden gates, only for them to be slammed shut in their faces. Inside, British guards fought yard by yard, muskets turned to clubs, smoke burning their lungs. And here's the shocking truth most people never knew. Hougoumont was never meant to win the battle. It was meant to distract Napoleon, keep his eye fixed on a corner while the real game unfolded elsewhere. But the Emperor couldn't ignore it. He sent more men, more fire, more fury, each wave swallowed by that stubborn farmhouse. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield was chaos. Smoke so thick men couldn't see 10 paces. The cries of the wounded rose over the thunder of guns. And yet through it all, Napoleon stood firm on a small hill near La Belle Alliance, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the British centre. Then, in the distance, through the haze, one of his marshals spotted movement along the eastern horizon. Dark lines. Long lines, Napoleon frowned. Whose troops are those? A pause, a heartbeat. Then the answer that chilled him. It could be the Prussians, sire. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. He did not believe it. Not yet. He turned back to the battlefield, determined to break Wellington before those shadows arrived. Orders flew down the line. Drummers beat the rhythm of fate. The French columns formed once more, and the valley of Waterloo shook as they advanced again, bayonets gleaming like rows of silver teeth. And somewhere behind the ridge, Wellington whispered to an aide, "Night or reinforcements, one of them will save us." But fate, once again, was undecided. The rain had stopped, but the mud still clung to boots, wheels and hooves, dragging every movement to half its speed. The French guns thundered again, closer now, the balls tearing through earth and flesh alike. A British officer shouted for his men to hold the line. A cannon exploded beside him, flinging bodies like straw. Still the ridge held. Napoleon clenched his jaw. His plan was unravelling in slow motion. The delays, the weather, the stubborn British defence, it was all converging against him. And then, as if to mock his genius, a messenger arrived from the right flank. "Marshal Grouchy has not engaged the Prussians, sire. They're moving, quickly." For the first time that day, the Emperor's face hardened. "Find Grouchy, tell him to hold them, at all costs." The messenger galloped off into the haze, though few believed he'd ever reach the Marshal in time. Down in the valley, the French pressed harder. The British lines bent but did not break. The air was a symphony of screams and gunfire. The Emperor's cannons fired blind into the smoke, each shot meant to break the will of a nation. But Wellington, ever patient, simply waited. "They'll come again," he said softly. "And when they do, we'll finish them." Evening drew closer, the light dimming to an amber haze. The Emperor's confidence began to flicker. Behind the smoke, he thought he saw movement again. More columns, more banners, but not his own. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone felt it. The storm that had delayed the morning was returning in a new form, an army of vengeance marching from the east. And as the French troops prepared for one more desperate assault, a question hung in the air like the smell of powder. Would the Emperor crush the ridge before the Black Coats arrived, or would the ghosts of Prussia rise from the mud and seal his fate once and for all? The sun dipped below the ridge, blood red through the smoke, and for one long, trembling moment, the field fell silent, before the cannon spoke again. The ridge of illusion's evening had begun to slip its fingers across the sky, painting the smoke in bruised shades of violet and gold. The ridge where Wellington stood was no longer a line, it was a wound. Men knelt in the mud, faces blackened, blood mingling with rain. The air itself trembled with cannon fire, and yet the Duke did not move. Through the haze, he could still see them, the French cavalry, shattered but unbroken, retreating to reform. He'd expected them to stop, to falter, but no. They were gathering again, far below. The Emperor's banners still waved defiantly above La Belle Alliance. Wellington tightened his jaw. "He's not finished," he murmured. Napoleon wasn't. The Emperor sat on horseback now, surrounded by aides, staring at the ridge through his spyglass. Beyond it, the British line lay hidden, silent, like a snake in tall grass. His pride refused to admit what his eyes already knew, that every charge had failed. The ridge had swallowed his cavalry whole, but he had one weapon left, one that had never failed him before, the Imperial Guard. Those words carried a weight that silenced men. The Guard were his veterans, his hammer of destiny, the soldiers who had never broken, who had carried his empire from the sands of Egypt to the snows of Russia. To unleash them was to play his final card, and still he hesitated. From the east came the growing thunder of Prussian guns, their echoes rolling like a storm announcing its arrival. The Emperor's time was collapsing, minute by minute, yet pride held him captive. He looked toward Hougoumont, the inferno still burning defiantly, and muttered, "They're still fighting for that gate." Marshal Ney rode up, his uniform in tatters, eyes bloodshot with smoke. "Sire, the line will not hold. We must strike now, with everything we have." Napoleon's reply was soft, almost weary. "Everything, yes." He lowered the glass. "Prepare the guard." Below the ridge, the world shifted. Drums began to beat, not fast, not frantic, but steady, the rhythm of destiny. Men turned their heads to see them marching, tall, grim, faces set in stone. Bears' fur hats glistened under the dim light, their uniforms immaculate even amidst ruin. To the French soldiers watching, the sight reignited something deep. Hope, pride, the old fire of empire. "Vive l'Empereur!" someone shouted, and for a fleeting moment, the battlefield seemed to breathe again. Wellington heard it too, the chant rolling across the valley like an omen. He lowered his glass and whispered to an aide, "That must be the guard." Then, louder, "Tell the men, hold their fire until they see the whites of their eyes." Down below, the guard advanced. Each step was measured, precise. Smoke swirled around them like ghosts. The earth shook with every volley from the French guns behind them. And as they moved up the ridge, bayonets gleaming, the last light of the sun broke through the clouds, gold on steel, fire on flesh. It looked unstoppable. But what happened next? No historian expected. When the guard crested the ridge, they saw nothing. No enemy, no movement, just fog and the whisper of wind. The British had vanished behind the slope, hidden by cunning and terrain. Then, as if the earth itself awoke, the ridge exploded with fire. A wall of musket smoke burst across their front. 2,000 rifles fired in perfect unison. The guards staggered. Men fell like grain before the scythe. Still, they came on. Reload, fire, reload, fire. The British lines roared again. French drums beat frantically to hold formation. Officers shouted, waving swords, trying to rally the men, but the illusion was breaking. The ridge that had seemed empty now revealed its truth, a killing ground designed by Wellington himself. The guard pressed forward through fire and iron, step by step. Their cries echoed through the smoke. Vive l'Empereur! For a moment, they even reached the crest, bayonets clashing, bodies colliding in desperate struggle. But the line did not break. Behind the first volley, another waited, and another still. The ridge spat defiance with every heartbeat. Wellington himself rode down the line, calm amid the chaos. "Stand firm, men! Give them everything!" he shouted. The soldiers cheered through gritted teeth, smoke thick in their lungs. And then, something shifted in the air. To the left, faint at first but growing, came a new roar, the sound of men marching, shouting in guttural voices. Black-coated figures emerged from the haze like phantoms. The Prussians had arrived. Napoleon's heart stopped. He turned sharply, scanning the eastern fields. It was no illusion. Blucher's army was pouring in, their banners dark against the dying light. Thousands of them, crashing into his right flank like a tidal wave. The Emperor's map, his perfect plan, disintegrated before his eyes. "Where is Grouchy?" he demanded. No one answered. Grouchy, miles away, was chasing shadows, too far to save him. The illusion of control shattered. On the ridge, the guard began to falter. They were surrounded by smoke and death, their shouts drowned by cannon fire. Yet they refused to retreat. Their pride would not allow it. "La garde meurt mais ne se rend pas." The guard dies but does not surrender. Wellington saw them wavering and gave the order. The British infantry surged forward, bayonets fixed, their cheers rising above the din. The counter-attack swept down the slope like a thunderclap. The French line broke. For the first time in history, the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's sacred elite, turned and fell back. And when the rest of the French army saw it, panic spread like wildfire. "La garde recule," they cried. The guard retreats. Those 3 words were death to morale. In moments, the battlefield dissolved into chaos. Soldiers threw down their weapons, fled into the dark, or trampled one another in the mud. From his hill, Napoleon watched the collapse unfold. The smoke parted for a brief instant, and he saw them, his men, streaming away in terror. His mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, the Emperor of France stood truly alone. Wellington lowered his sword. "It's over," he murmured, but the wind disagreed, because down by La Belle Alliance, the Emperor's carriage still waited, and beside it, a cluster of officers refused to flee. Cannons still fired sporadically, defiant against the inevitable. The field was not yet silent. Napoleon sat still, his face pale in the fading light. Around him, the empire he'd built from ashes was dissolving back into them. And yet, he did not leave. Not yet. He turned his horse toward the ridge one last time. Somewhere out there, through the smoke and ruin, his guard still fought. And for a fleeting heartbeat, he imagined the impossible, that the line could rally, that one last charge could turn the tide. But as he looked up, he saw the Prussian banners cresting the horizon, black against a blood-red sky. The Emperor closed his eyes. "So it ends," he whispered. Behind him, the sound of hooves thundered again, his escort calling for retreat. But Napoleon didn't move. His gaze lingered on the ridge, where the smoke drifted like ghosts of all he'd lost. The sun had finally set over Waterloo. But the night was only beginning. The black coats in the distant darkness crept slowly over the battlefield, swallowing the shapes of men, horses, and ruin. Smoke hung thick in the air, clinging to the ground like a shroud. The thunder of cannon fire had begun to fade, but not the fear. Across the valley, fires still burned, flickering on broken wheels and shattered muskets. Napoleon sat silent upon his horse, motionless, the light from the nearby flames casting a bronze gleam across his face. Around him, his generals waited, whispering orders that no one seemed willing to carry out. He no longer looked like an emperor. He looked like a man listening to the death of everything he had built. Then came the sound, distant, rhythmic, undeniable, drums, not French. At first faint as a heartbeat, then growing louder, rolling from the east like the approach of fate itself. The men around Napoleon froze, listening. The emperor's eyes narrowed. He turned toward the horizon, where the last glimmers of sunset still glowed red through the smoke. There they were, a long, dark river of movement spilling over the fields beyond Plancenoit. Thousands of Prussian troops, their black coats shining wet under the twilight. Torches moved among them like crawling stars. The emperor drew a slow breath. So Blücher has come after all. He knew in that instant. The battle was no longer his to win. It was his to survive. But survival was not yet certain. To the west, the British were regrouping, readying their final assault. To the east, the Prussians were closing in fast. Napoleon's army, once the most disciplined in Europe, was breaking apart under pressure from both sides. His right flank had already buckled. The centre wavered. The guard, the proud, unbroken guard, was exhausted and bleeding. Still, he refused to flee. "Hold Plancenoit," he ordered, his voice low but sharp as steel. "If the Prussians take that village, we are finished." Marshal Lobau, exhausted and covered in soot, saluted. "We will hold, sire." To the last. In Plancenoit, the fight became something primal. The narrow streets filled with smoke and screams as French and Prussian soldiers collided at bayonet range. Flames leapt from the church roof. Bells melted and fell from their beams. Men fought in doorways, on rooftops, among the dead. No line, no order, only chaos. And still, from the east, more Prussians came. By now, Wellington had learned of their arrival. He stood at the ridge, weary but unbroken, watching through the dark. "Blücher's here," he said quietly. "Then this is the end." But even endings have their tricks. Down in the valley, as the Prussians drove deeper, Napoleon unleashed his last reserve, the young guard. They stormed into Plancenoit with bayonets lowered, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Their fury was desperate, unstoppable for a time. They pushed the Prussians back through the streets, retook the church, and held fast amid the ruins. The village burned around them. The dead lay in heaps at the crossroads. The smell of smoke and blood filled the air. Yet for a brief, fleeting hour, the French line held again. Napoleon turned to his aides, voice rising for the first time in hours. "See, they can be stopped. The field is not lost." But fate was patient. While Plancenoit burned, the Prussian flanks widened, curling around the French position like a tightening fist. Reinforcements poured in from Wavre. Fresh troops against soldiers who had been fighting since dawn. The black coats moved with grim determination, closing the trap. Napoleon could see the shape of his empire's grave forming in the dusk, and yet he would not retreat. He dismounted, took his telescope, and stared into the smoke toward the ridge where the British flag still stood. His face was unreadable. "Tell the guard to form up," he said quietly. "We will make one last stand at La Belle Alliance." And this is where everything changed. As the remnants of his army fell back toward the centre, the Imperial Guard formed ranks one final time. The drummers beat slowly, their hands trembling. Torches flickered in the wet wind. These were men who had marched with him from Egypt to Moscow. They knew what this meant, and still, not one refused. "Soldiers of France," Napoleon called, his voice hoarse yet clear across the field. "The hour has come. The enemy believes us defeated. Show them they are wrong." For a heartbeat, the men answered, "Vive l'Empereur!" a cry both proud and tragic. Then they marched into the dark. At first, the advance was steady. Through the haze, their silhouettes looked almost spectral, ghostly figures walking into history. The British line, weary but waiting, held its fire until they were close. Too close. The first volley tore through the front ranks. Still they came on. The second volley struck harder. Smoke burst across the field. Screams drowned beneath musket thunder. The guard tried to close the gap, but the ground before them had turned into a field of fire. The illusion of invincibility shattered. When the Prussian guns opened from the flank, the French position imploded. The guard began to fall back, slow at first, then faster. Their officers shouted, begged, threatened, but the field had turned against them. Behind them, the rest of the army broke completely. Napoleon watched it unfold, silent. The guard retreats. Those words spread like poison through the ranks. Men dropped their weapons. Cavalry fled into the night. The emperor's once mighty host dissolved into shadows, trampled by fear. At La Belle Alliance, his carriage stood waiting. An aide approached hesitantly. "Sire." "You must go." Napoleon did not answer. He watched the distant ridge, now ablaze with musket flashes, and whispered something only he could hear. Perhaps it was regret, perhaps disbelief. Then he turned, climbed into the carriage, and was gone. Behind him, Waterloo roared its final chorus, a storm of defeat, a requiem for empire. The Prussians pushed through Plancenoit. The British advanced down the ridge, and the last light of day vanished into smoke. But among the wreckage, the emperor's legend refused to die. Soldiers who fled that night would swear for decades afterward that they had seen him still riding through the smoke, calm and unbent, searching for a way to turn back time. And as the blackcoats marched across the field to meet Wellington at La Belle Alliance, their torches glowing against the night sky, the world realized that one man's ambition had ended and another age had begun. Yet one question lingered, heavy as cannon smoke over the valley. Would the world ever see such a man again? The last guard night had fallen over Waterloo, but the battlefield still burned. Fires flickered in the ruins of farms and villages, casting twisted shadows across the dead. The air reeked of gunpowder and smoke, of sweat and blood and rain-soaked earth. It was not silence that ruled now, but a strange, broken stillness. A silence haunted by the echoes of everything that had just died. Somewhere in that ruin stood the old guard. They were fewer than 1,000 now, their blue coats dark with soot and blood. Faces hardened by decades of war stared into the night, waiting for orders that would never save them. Behind them, Napoleon's carriage had already rolled into the darkness toward Charleroi, leaving the emperor's last disciples to fight in his name, even as his empire crumbled to dust. And yet, they did not flee. They stood. Sergeant Roussel adjusted his grip on his musket, eyes scanning the ridge ahead. Smoke drifted through the moonlight, ghostly and slow. Somewhere beyond it, the British were advancing again, steady, methodical, relentless. Roussel's lips moved, whispering the old words. "Vive l'Empereur!" A captain rode past on a limping horse. "Men of the guard," he shouted. "This is the line. We hold here. No retreat!" His voice cracked with the strain of the day, but his spirit was iron. "Show them how an emperor's guard dies." The men answered with silence. They didn't need words. On the other side of the field, Wellington surveyed the destruction. The victory he'd fought for all day still felt unreal. Thousands of men lay between the lines, some crying out, some never to move again. The Duke's face was grey with exhaustion. "They're finished," one of his aides murmured. But Wellington shook his head. "Not yet. Not while the guard stands." And indeed, they did. The French line had disintegrated everywhere else, but in the centre, on that final slope of earth, the guard formed into squares once more. Bayonets gleamed under the dim light. Torn banners fluttered like dying flames. Then the British came. A roar rose across the field as volleys tore through the dark. The guard fired back, their muskets flaring orange in the gloom. Each blast illuminated faces carved in defiance. They were surrounded now, Prussians closing from one side, British from another, but they refused to bend. And this is where everything changed. A single voice rang out among the chaos, a British officer calling for surrender. "Lay down your arms, men. The battle is over!" The French captain stepped forward, sword raised, smoke swirling around him. His reply was calm, almost gentle. "La garde meurt, mais ne se rend pas." The guard dies, but does not surrender. It was not bravado. It was prophecy. Volley after volley ripped through their ranks. Men fell silently, collapsing beside the fallen flags. Yet every time the smoke cleared, the survivors were still standing, still firing. They were ghosts, refusing to vanish. Wellington watched from afar. expression unreadable. "By God," he whispered, "they do not break." And for a moment, the whole battlefield seemed to hold its breath. British, Prussian, French alike, all watching that small, unyielding square defy the inevitable. But the world was moving on, whether they believed it or not. The Prussians surged closer from the right, their torches cutting through the haze. Cavalry swept in to encircle what was left of the guard. Still the French fired, each shot slower, weaker. Their ammunition was running out. Roussel reloaded one last time, his hands shaking. He thought of home, of the sound of his mother's voice, of the Emperor's gaze on the morning parade. He aimed into the smoke and fired. Then he fell to his knees, musket slipping from his grasp. When the next volley came, it finished what history had already decided. The guard was gone. But their legend was only beginning. The last gunfire faded into the mist, and what replaced it was not triumph, but exhaustion. The victors stood among the wreckage, too weary to cheer. Wellington lowered his sword and whispered, "Night, at last." He had won, but at a cost that could never be counted. Blücher rode up beside him, his coat black with mud. "It is done," the Prussian said gruffly. "The ogre is crushed." The Duke glanced toward La Belle Alliance, where the faint glow of Napoleon's campfire had already gone out. "Crushed," he echoed, though the word felt heavy, but not forgotten, because even as the Prussians pressed onward, chasing the remnants of the French army into the night, something lingered over the field, a sense that this was not merely an end, but a reckoning. Down the road to Genappe, the Emperor's carriage rattled through the rain. Inside, Napoleon sat motionless, staring out the small window. His uniform was spattered with mud, his face pale under the dim lamp. The roar of the battlefield still echoed in his mind. The shouts, the cannon fire, the chant of Vive l'Empereur. He knew it was over. But what haunted him most was not the defeat. It was how close victory had been. A single hour of dry ground, a single delayed march by Blücher, a single stronger flank, and the world might still have knelt to him. He closed his eyes, hearing again the sound of the guards' drums fading in the smoke. For the first time in years, he felt something he could not command: regret. Behind him, the fields of Waterloo lay still. The fires had burned low. The dead outnumbered the living, and on that blood-soaked soil, the map of Europe was being rewritten in silence. Yet something unseen had also survived: the myth of a man who refused to yield. In the years that followed, soldiers would tell stories by candlelight, of the day the Emperor faced the world and lost, but did not bow. They would speak of the Guard's last stand as if it were a sacred thing, a moment when honour outlived hope, and across the continent, kings would rebuild their thrones, fearful that somewhere, somehow, another Napoleon might rise from the ashes. But for now, the night belonged to ghosts. The wind carried the faint echo of drums through the valley, mingling with the rain. The earth that had swallowed empires lay quiet, but it remembered. And though the Emperor rode away into exile, history was not yet finished with him, because far to the south, across the dark sea, a lonely island awaited, a place where the last light of an empire would flicker once more before fading forever. But that is another story.